I never thought I would write these words. I never imagined I'd have to confess something so horrifying, so utterly devastating. But here I am, and I can't keep it in any longer. The night my father sold me out to my stepmother, it wasn't a betrayal I could have anticipated. It was the kind of betrayal that leaves you gasping for air, that makes you question every memory you've ever had. It all began when I was 18. I had just finished high school, full of hope, ready to start college, and dreaming of a life far away from the small, suffocating town where I grew up. My father, a man I had once trusted blindly, always seemed distant but dependable. He had a way of smiling at me that made me believe everything was under control. He would pat my shoulder and say things like, "Don't worry, son, I'll handle it." I never knew those words were the first cracks in the foundation of my life. My stepmother entered our lives when I was 12, and at first I welcomed her with a tentative hope that maybe she would bring warmth, a sense of stability. My biological mother had passed away suddenly, leaving a void no one could fill. But my father insisted, over and over, that we needed someone to help manage the household, someone to guide me and my younger sister. I wanted to believe him, I really did. It wasn't long before I started noticing strange patterns. My stepmother was always impeccably dressed, always cheerful in front of my father, but there was something about her eyes, cold, calculating, and often fixated on me in ways that made my stomach turn. I couldn't name it, but a small, persistent dread settled into my chest every time she was around. My father seemed oblivious, or perhaps complicit. Then came the first hints of the betrayal. Money would appear in her purse, large sums I couldn't understand, and my father would smile and nod whenever she mentioned it. I didn't know the full story at the time, but the unease settled into a growing suspicion. My father began spending less time with me, less time asking how school was, less time showing any real concern. It was as if I were becoming dispensable. The true horror came in a quiet moment, one evening when my father called me into his study. I thought it might be about college applications, about the future we had always dreamed of together. But the look on his face made my stomach twist into knots. He was smiling, yes, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a predatory, businesslike smile. "I've made arrangements for you," he said, casually, as if discussing the weather. "You'll be staying with your stepmother for a while. It's better this way." I froze. "What do you mean?" My voice trembled. "You're a burden," he interrupted, almost laughing. "She's agreed to take care of you for a fee." I couldn't process his words. A fee? Take care of me? My mind reeled, trying to form the sentences that could convey the betrayal, the horror. But my father just looked at me, expectant, as if I should have been grateful. And that was the first moment I realized my life, my childhood, my very trust in the man who was supposed to protect me had been traded like currency. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My stepmother smiled sweetly at me, as if this were a normal, mundane arrangement. But I saw the glint in her eyes, a glint of satisfaction, of power, of ownership. From that day, everything changed. My father stopped answering my questions. My stepmother became the gatekeeper of my life. And I began to understand the terrifying reality. I was no longer just a son or a child. I was a commodity. The first week under her care was a nightmare. She set strict rules, monitored every action, every word I spoke. I was not allowed to leave the house without permission, and my phone, my schoolwork, even my friends became restricted. I started keeping a diary in secret, pouring every fear, every suspicion, every heartbreak into its pages. It was the only place where I could still feel like myself. And then, the moment that truly shattered me, that turned the gnawing fear into a burning, consuming terror, came in the form of a letter. I found it tucked in a drawer, meant to be hidden, but I couldn't resist. It was from my father to my stepmother. The words made my stomach turn and my hands shake. Payment has been transferred. The boy will stay with you indefinitely. Thank you for taking care of him. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. My father had sold me. The man who had held me as a child, who had tucked me into bed, who had smiled at me and promised to protect me, had handed him over for money. And the woman who had smiled sweetly while pretending to care had orchestrated it all, relishing in the power she now held over me. From that day, everything changed. My father stopped answering my questions. My stepmother became the gatekeeper of my life. And I began to understand the terrifying reality. I was no longer just a son or a child. I was a commodity. The first week under her care was a nightmare. She set strict rules, monitored every action, every word I spoke. I was not allowed to leave the house without permission, and my phone, my schoolwork, even my friends became restricted. I started keeping a diary in secret, pouring every fear, every suspicion, every heartbreak into its pages. It was the only place where I could still feel like myself. And then, the moment that truly shattered me, that turned the gnawing fear into a burning, consuming terror, came in the form of a letter. I found it tucked in a drawer, meant to be hidden, but I couldn't resist. It was from my father to my stepmother. The words made my stomach turn and my hands shake. Payment has been transferred. The boy will stay with you indefinitely. Thank you for taking care of him. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. My father had sold me. The man who had held me as a child, who had tucked me into bed, who had smiled at me and promised to protect me, had handed him over for money. And the woman who had smiled sweetly while pretending to care had orchestrated it all, relishing in the power she now held over me. From that day, everything changed. My father stopped answering my questions. My stepmother became the gatekeeper of my life, and I began to understand the terrifying reality. I was no longer just a son or a child. I was a commodity. The first week under her care was a nightmare. She set strict rules, monitored every action, every word I spoke. I was not allowed to leave the house without permission, and my phone, my schoolwork, even my friends became restricted. I started keeping a diary in secret, pouring every fear, every suspicion, every heartbreak into its pages. It was the only place where I could still feel like myself. And then, the moment that truly shattered me, that turned the gnawing fear into a burning, consuming terror, came in the form of a letter. I found it tucked in a drawer, but I couldn't resist. It was from my father to my stepmother. The words made my stomach turn and my hands shake. Payment has been transferred. The boy will stay with you indefinitely. Thank you for taking care of him. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. My father had sold me. The man who had held me as a child, who had tucked me into bed, who had smiled at me and promised to protect me, had handed him over for money. And the woman who had smiled sweetly while pretending to care had orchestrated it all, relishing in the power she now held over me. From that day, everything changed. My father stopped answering my questions. My stepmother became the gatekeeper of my life, and I began to understand the terrifying reality. I was no longer just a son or a child. I was a commodity. The first week under her care was a nightmare. She set strict rules, monitored every action, every word I spoke. I was not allowed to leave the house without permission, and my phone, my schoolwork, even my friends became restricted. I started keeping a diary in secret, pouring every fear, every suspicion, every heartbreak into its pages. It was the only place where I could still feel like myself. And then, the moment that truly shattered me, that turned the gnawing fear into a burning, consuming terror, came in the form of a letter. I found it tucked in a drawer, but I couldn't resist. It was from my father to my stepmother. The words made my stomach turn and my hands shake. Payment has been transferred. The boy will stay with you indefinitely. Thank you for taking care of him. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. She avoided sitting near me, avoided casual touches that might have been considered affectionate, and instead maintained a formal, almost clinical demeanor. Even my father, once so familiar and warm, now seemed distant, preoccupied with business matters or endless meetings, leaving me in a limbo of isolation. One evening, curiosity and fear combined, and I tried to confront her indirectly. I asked innocuous questions about the day, about school assignments, about things only I could know. She answered politely, but I noticed the way her eyes darted away, how her fingers fiddled nervously with the edge of her blouse. There was an evasiveness in her demeanor that felt like a door closing in my face. And the more she avoided, the more I sensed the hidden truth, something dark, something deliberate, something I wasn't yet ready to name. Then came the first tangible evidence. I stumbled upon a small envelope tucked behind a drawer in her bedroom. It wasn't much, a single sheet of paper with a phone number I didn't recognize, and a cryptic note that simply said, "Tonight, don't fail." My hands shook as I read it. Questions crashed through my mind. Who was she meeting? What did this mean for me? And most terrifyingly, why was my father absent from any part of this? Sleep became a stranger. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the hallway, set my mind racing. I began noting the times she would leave the house, tracking patterns I didn't understand. She would return late at night, always with a story about a friend or a meeting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was living a parallel life, one that had nothing to do with me, except as a pawn. The sense of being watched, monitored, and manipulated became suffocating. As days turned into weeks, the ambiguity became almost unbearable. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but fear held me back. There was power in her presence that intimidated me, a calculated dominance that made any potential rebellion feel futile. And yet, despite the fear, I started to plan. I began to write down the strange occurrences, the inconsistencies, the moments when I knew she had slipped up. Each note, each detail was a small weapon I could wield when the time was right. The real turning point, however, came when I first encountered undeniable evidence of the deception. One evening, while retrieving a book from the living room, I noticed a phone left unattended on the couch. Hesitation warred with urgency, but I couldn't resist. The messages on the screen made my stomach twist into knots. They weren't just casual conversations. They were detailed, intimate communications between her and someone else. The texts spoke of arrangements, of manipulation, of financial gain. And at the center of it all, me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the darkness, my eyes fixed on the dim glow of my phone, rereading the messages over and over. Anger, fear, sadness, and confusion swirled inside me like a storm I couldn't escape. My father's betrayal became clearer than ever. My stepmother's role in this dark plot was now undeniable, and I understood with chilling certainty that my life had become a chessboard, and I was merely a pawn. For the first time, I realized that my survival depended on knowledge. I needed to see, to understand, to gather every detail before acting. The journey ahead was terrifying, uncertain, and merciless. And as I sat there, heart pounding, I made a silent promise to myself. I will not be broken. I will not be forgotten. I will uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The following days were unbearable. Every interaction with my stepmother felt like walking on a tightrope over a pit of vipers. I became hyper-aware of every movement, every glance, every word. I caught her whispering into her phone, just enough to make me feel excluded, like a shadow in my own home. My father, blissfully oblivious or willfully ignorant, continued his routines, never acknowledging the tension that had poisoned the air between us. Then it happened. First, undeniable evidence. One evening, after my stepmother had gone to the kitchen to prepare tea, I noticed a folder half hidden under the sofa cushion. It wasn't just papers. It was a collection of receipts, photographs, and notes that spelled out her manipulation with terrifying clarity. Hotel stays, late-night dinners, unexplained transfers of money. Everything pointed to a plan executed long before I realized it existed. My hands trembled as I flipped through the documents, my mind spinning with rage and disbelief. How could my father, my own flesh and blood, participate in this? How could he sell me out so completely? Sleep became impossible. Nights stretched endlessly, and I found myself wandering through the house in a haze, replaying every moment, every conversation, trying to find a sign I had missed. Each memory, once comforting, now felt like a trap laid to ensnare me. My stepmother's laughter, once just a background noise, now echoed in my mind like a sinister melody. I became obsessed with the timing of her movements, tracking her departures and arrivals with a precision that made me feel both vigilant and paranoid. The first confrontation was inevitable. I couldn't keep this seething anger bottled any longer. I cornered her in the living room, the evidence clutched tightly in my hands. My voice shook, though I tried to mask it with anger. "What is this? Who are you meeting at these hotels? Why are these messages here?" Her expression, carefully controlled until now, faltered for the briefest moment. But instead of confessing, she turned the situation against me, accusing me of being paranoid, of imagining betrayals that didn't exist. Her skill at manipulation was infuriating. I could feel my frustration boil over, yet her calmness only fueled my rage. Family dynamics began to complicate matters further. My siblings, some of whom had always been close, began questioning my motives. Some were sympathetic, quietly whispering their doubts, while others sided with her, convinced that I was overreacting. The house, once a sanctuary, became a battleground of whispered accusations, pointed glances, and unspoken alliances. Even my friends seemed unsure. The story sounded unbelievable, too cinematic to be real. And yet, I had proof. Tangible, undeniable proof. Every day brought new signs of duplicity. Another receipt, another strange phone number, another late-night call intercepted while she thought I was asleep. Each discovery felt like a fresh wound, reopening old scars and cutting deeper. My anger became a living thing inside me, gnawing at every rational thought, demanding action, demanding confrontation, demanding justice. I tried to maintain normalcy, to mask my growing suspicions with polite smiles and casual conversation, but the effort was exhausting. The tension between what I knew and what I pretended to know weighed on me, twisting my thoughts, clouding my judgment. At times, I wondered if I had become obsessive, if I was losing my mind. But the evidence, the cold, hard evidence, kept me tethered to reality. One evening, the breaking point came. I found a hotel receipt tucked behind a book on her bedside table, time-stamped late into the night, accompanied by a small note in handwriting that was unmistakably hers. "Do not falter. Everything is proceeding as planned." I couldn't contain myself any longer. The room spun around me as rage and betrayal collided inside my chest. I realized with absolute clarity that my stepmother and father had conspired against me, trading my trust and safety for money and convenience. I made a decision. I couldn't act blindly, but I couldn't wait any longer either. I began meticulously planning, taking careful notes of her comings and goings, memorizing every detail, every nuance of her behavior. I knew I needed leverage, a way to confront them when the timing was right, when the world would witness their treachery, not just me. And then, a small, seemingly insignificant slip changed everything. She answered a call in the living room while thinking I was elsewhere, speaking in a tone far too familiar for someone she had only just claimed to care about. The words she used, the intimacy in her voice, confirmed what I had suspected all along. She wasn't just manipulating me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My father's betrayal was complete. He had handed me over, figuratively and literally, into her hands, and I was powerless to stop it, until now. The seeds of conflict had grown into a full-blown storm, and I could feel the calm before the hurricane. I knew what I had to do next. Observe, gather more proof, prepare for the confrontation that would finally expose them both. The house, once familiar, now felt alien. Every room, every hallway, every shadow held potential clues, potential threats. I became a silent observer in my own home, moving quietly, watching, listening, waiting for the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I promised myself that I would not let them destroy me. I would reclaim my life, my dignity, and my future, no matter the cost. The days that followed were unbearable, each moment thick with tension, every glance a potential threat, every word a weapon. I became acutely aware of every detail, how she moved through the house, how my father avoided my gaze, how the shadows seemed to hide secrets that I had only just begun to suspect. The evidence I had gathered was enough to make me furious, but it wasn't complete. I needed more, proof that could shatter the illusion entirely, something undeniable that would expose their betrayal for everyone to see. One evening, while pretending to leave for work, I lingered just outside the living room. My stepmother entered the room with a small envelope in her hand, her expression unusually guarded. I crouched behind the corner, straining to hear. She spoke softly, almost reverently, into her phone. The words she used chilled me to the bone. "It's all set. He has no idea. Everything will go as planned." That single statement, so casual yet so damning, confirmed every suspicion I had been grappling with. She had been manipulating, plotting, orchestrating my humiliation, and my father was complicit. The storm inside me grew uncontrollable.
anger, betrayal, fear. They collided, forming a suffocating mass that made my chest ache. I paced my room that night, replaying every memory through a lens of suspicion. Every smile, every kind gesture from my father and stepmother, every evening spent in what I thought was normalcy. It was all a lie. My world had shifted, tilting on its axis, and there was no way to return to the innocence I once took for granted. The next confrontation was sharper, more deliberate. I waited until my father returned from work, feigning ignorance, as if nothing had changed. When he entered, I asked, calmly but with an edge, about the envelopes, the late-night calls, the unusual activity he had been ignoring. His reaction was immediate and infuriating: denial, anger, and a twisted form of accusation aimed back at me. "Why are you always suspicious? Do you think everyone is out to get you?" His words, dripping with false concern, only fueled the fire inside me. I realized then that he was not just a passive participant, he was an active enabler, a partner in their scheme. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a stage for tension and humiliation. Family members began noticing the subtle fractures, and whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors, too, started looking at me differently, sensing the unrest that hung in the air like a thick fog. I could feel eyes on us, judgment and curiosity mixed together, and it made the next steps even more critical. I needed undeniable proof, evidence so solid that no one could deny it, no matter how they tried to rationalize or justify their actions. It came sooner than I expected. While following my stepmother one evening, I saw her meet someone in a secluded cafe. The interaction was brief, but the exchange of envelopes, whispered words, and furtive glances left no doubt. I snapped a few discreet photos, my hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. This was it, the piece that would finally complete the puzzle. I had partial truths before, but now I had tangible proof. Every receipt, every message, every clandestine meeting was part of a damning narrative that I could finally piece together. Returning home, I felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on me. The confrontation I had imagined countless times in my mind was coming closer. I could sense the tension building in every corner, every hallway, every room. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the knowledge of what was about to happen. My stepmother's casual demeanor no longer fooled me. Her smiles, her gestures, even her laughter now carried the weight of deceit. And then a slip. A minor miscalculation on her part exposed more than she intended. She left a notebook on the kitchen counter, one I had never seen before. The pages were filled with detailed notes, schedules, coded messages, plans for manipulating not only me, but the family, instructions for my father, reminders to maintain appearances. I read through it with a mix of horror and fascination, each page confirming that everything I feared was true. The depth of the deception was staggering. I realized the betrayal was more systematic, more calculated than I had ever imagined. I felt my mind spinning, my heart pounding in my chest. The partial truths, the slips, the undeniable evidence, it all came together in a moment of clarity that was both terrifying and empowering. I was no longer a passive victim. I was a witness to their treachery, armed with the knowledge and evidence to confront them on my terms. The storm inside me had reached a boiling point, and I knew that the next confrontation would not be gentle or measured. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed everything, preparing for the inevitable. The tension in the house was palpable, even through closed doors. I could hear faint movements, soft murmurs, and the occasional nervous laugh from my stepmother. My father, unaware that I knew everything, moved through his evening routine as if nothing had changed. But I was ready. I had the evidence, the clarity, and the determination to finally bring their deceit into the open. As I drifted into a restless sleep, I promised myself one thing. When the time came, I would not hold back. I would expose the betrayal in its entirety, confront the lies, and reclaim the life that had been stolen from me. Nothing would stop me. Not their words, not their threats, not the fear that had once kept me silent. The first peak had passed, and the real confrontation, the big climax, was on the horizon. The morning began like any other, but I could feel the tension coiling inside me like a spring ready to snap. Every sound in the house made me flinch. Footsteps on the stairs, doors opening and closing, murmurs of conversation. I had everything I needed now. Photos, recordings, receipts, and eyewitness accounts. The truth was no longer something that could be whispered about behind closed doors. It had to explode into the open. I could feel the storm gathering, ready to rip through the carefully constructed lies my father and stepmother had spun for years. It started in the living room. I had asked them to meet me, casually, but the weight in my voice betrayed me. They sensed it, and their composure cracked almost immediately. My father's eyes flickered with guilt, though he tried to mask it with false calm. My stepmother's smile was tight, strained, fragile. I waited for the exact moment, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then I laid everything out, every photo, every message, every clandestine meeting, every plan documented in her notebook. I watched as their faces shifted, color draining, eyes widening in shock and fear. "What is this?" my father stammered, but I could see the desperation beneath his words. I didn't answer. I let the evidence speak for itself. The receipts from expensive hotels, the photos of secret meetings, the messages revealing intimate and manipulative plots, they all painted a picture too damning to deny. My stepmother tried to snatch the photos from the table, her hands shaking. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling with panic. "I had to. He made me do it." But the words were hollow, meaningless in the face of irrefutable proof. I interrupted her. The tension snapped like a brittle branch under pressure. My father shouted, blaming me for reading messages, accusing me of paranoia, but no one believed him. Not anymore. I could see the shift in the room, the realization that the world they had built so carefully was crumbling around them. My stepmother broke down, tears streaming down her face, while my father's face turned pale, rage mingled with fear. I didn't stop there. I had invited my siblings, a few close friends, and even neighbors to witness the confrontation. Their presence was not meant for cruelty. It was meant to expose the truth, to let justice speak where words might fail. As they entered, the room filled with quiet shock. Whispers echoed, eyes widened, and a heavy tension settled over everyone present. They saw what I had uncovered. The betrayal in plain sight, undeniable and undeniable. The confrontation escalated, words spilling like venom. I shouted, my voice raw with emotion, each accusation precise, each detail a dagger aimed at their carefully constructed facades. "You sold me out. You betrayed every ounce of trust I gave. My life, my dignity, my soul, you destroyed it for money and power." My father tried to retort, but the crowd's silent judgment was deafening. My stepmother collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, and I felt a dark satisfaction in seeing the truth laid bare. Then came the emotional breakdown, the release of everything I had held in for years. My voice trembled as I described the loneliness, the humiliation, the nights spent questioning my own worth. Every detail of their betrayal was now a weapon and a revelation. I felt the raw edge of grief cut through me, but also a strange sense of liberation. I was no longer blind, no longer manipulated, no longer powerless. And then, the big twist. As I confronted them, a shocking revelation came to light. My father had not only betrayed me, but had orchestrated much of the deception to cover another secret. The person I had called my sister for years was not truly his child either. The betrayal extended deeper than I had imagined, a chain of lies stretching back decades. The room went silent, everyone reeling from the revelation. The gravity of the betrayal was staggering, leaving me and everyone present in stunned disbelief. By the end of the confrontation, there was no denying the consequences. My father and stepmother were stripped of the respect and trust they had taken for granted. Friends, neighbors, and family members looked at them with disgust and disbelief. The shame was public and complete. I, meanwhile, felt the weight of having exposed everything, and the bitter taste of victory mingled with exhaustion and sorrow. I knew the journey was far from over, but a turning point had been reached. For the first time in years, I felt the freedom that came from truth. The lies, the manipulations, the betrayals, they could no longer bind me. I had faced them head-on, shattered their illusions, and claimed the reality that had been stolen from me. The storm had passed, and the path forward, though uncertain, was mine to shape. The aftermath hit like a tidal wave. My father and stepmother were no longer untouchable, no longer the figures of authority and control they had pretended to be. The family gatherings turned cold. Relatives who once smiled and nodded in polite complicity now avoided their gaze, murmured behind their backs, or outright shunned them. The public shame they endured was immediate and unrelenting. My father, once the man who dictated every move in our lives, now faced contempt and disbelief at every turn. My stepmother's social circles evaporated as whispers spread like wildfire. The very people who had admired her cunning now regarded her with disgust, recognizing the depth of her deceit. Karma, it seemed, was swift and precise. For me, there was no instant relief, only a hollow space where anger and grief had tangled into a strange clarity. I had choices to make, paths to take. Divorce was inevitable. The bond that should have been unbreakable had been shattered beyond repair. I began the legal process, not with vengeance in mind, but to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Custody of what little peace remained, division of assets that had been manipulated against me. Each step was deliberate, each decision calculated. Yet beneath the procedural battles, a more subtle and personal form of revenge began to take shape. I wanted them to feel the full weight of the consequences, not just legally, but emotionally. It didn't take long. I exposed every detail of their betrayal publicly, carefully, with undeniable evidence. I didn't embellish the truth. Alone was enough to devastate. Friends and neighbors, some of whom had unknowingly been complicit, now witnessed the full scope of the deception. The effect was cathartic, both for me and for those who had been hurt silently for years. My father's reputation crumbled, his career opportunities evaporated as word of his treachery spread. My stepmother's social influence and professional endeavors were dismantled, and the community that once fawned over her turned cold and distant. Watching them face the consequences, I felt a grim sense of justice, a balance restored. however bitter the cost had been. Amid the chaos, I began to rebuild myself. It was not immediate, nor was it painless. The nights of sleepless grief, the mornings of anger and disbelief, they were replaced slowly with clarity and determination. I started small, reclaiming routines that had been disrupted by years of manipulation. Work became a refuge, a way to prove to myself that I could function, thrive, and succeed without being tethered to the shadow of betrayal. Slowly, confidence returned, not arrogantly, but quietly and steadily. I began exploring new connections, friendships rooted in honesty, and eventually glimpses of trust that had seemed impossible before. One particularly striking moment came when a distant friend reached out, someone who had observed everything silently, offering words of encouragement and support. "You didn't just survive," they said. "You reclaimed yourself." That simple affirmation encapsulated everything I had fought for. The realization that the power they had stolen was never truly theirs to hold. There were smaller, almost poetic moments of karma that gave me satisfaction. My father's closest ally, who had defended him fiercely, distanced themselves when the truth emerged. My stepmother, who had once flaunted her influence, found herself isolated, her manipulations exposed. The universe seemed to correct itself, aligning consequences with deeds. And though these moments didn't erase the pain, they validated every ounce of struggle I had endured. As I rose from the wreckage of betrayal, a new version of myself emerged, more resilient, more discerning, more deliberate. I was no longer the passive victim. I was an active agent of my life. I pursued new opportunities, invested in my personal growth, and allowed myself the rare, tentative joy of dreaming again. It was not about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation and the deliberate shaping of my future. Yet, even amidst the regained control, life whispered subtle reminders that the story was never fully closed. My ex-stepmother occasionally tried to reach out, her messages a mix of apology, manipulation, and empty attempts at reconciliation. I ignored most of them, replying only when necessary, never allowing myself to be drawn back into the web she had spun. And my younger sibling, the one who had watched silently, displayed unexpected reactions, sometimes distant, sometimes curious, hinting that the legacy of betrayal had left a mark even where it was least expected. I knew then that life was about constant vigilance. Trust could be rebuilt, but it could never be blind again. I had witnessed firsthand how easily people could betray, how subtly manipulation could take root. But I also learned that truth, patience, and deliberate action could restore balance, and sometimes even bring justice in ways that were both satisfying and morally precise. By the time I finally paused, the storm had settled, leaving a quieter, clearer landscape. The echoes of the past lingered, but they no longer controlled me. I had faced betrayal, public humiliation, and emotional devastation, and emerged not broken, but transformed.
Months passed, and the world began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a space I could inhabit without fear. The raw, burning pain of betrayal gradually softened into a quiet awareness of the lessons it had forced me to learn. I had survived the storm, and in that survival, I found unexpected clarity. Life had shifted beneath my feet, but instead of being crushed, I adapted, evolved, and reclaimed my sense of self. Each day, I reminded myself that the power they had stolen from me, my dignity, my trust, my voice, was mine again, stronger and more unshakable than ever before. My father and stepmother had faded from my daily reality, but their decline was impossible to ignore. Word of their social and professional failures had spread throughout the community, and the people who once envied them now pitied them or even scorned them outright. The contrast between our paths could not have been more stark. I, scarred but upright, learning, growing, embracing life with renewed purpose. They, isolated and diminished, trapped in the consequences of their own actions. Witnessing their downfall was strangely satisfying, not from a place of cruelty, but from the assurance that justice had a rhythm, that karma was real and inevitable. I spent time reflecting on everything, the lies, the manipulations, the cold calculations. It was difficult, sometimes unbearable, but confession-style reflection became my catharsis. I wrote in my journal late at night, reliving moments, analyzing reactions, and slowly piecing together how I could have maintained my power even while powerless. Writing became more than therapy. It became a map for my future, a record of resilience I could always look back on. And with this clarity came the hard-earned ability to forgive. Not them, not yet, but myself. I had doubted, been naive, trusted blindly, but I had learned to recognize manipulation, to set boundaries, and to value my own judgment above anyone else's influence. Forgiveness, in this sense, was liberation. It allowed me to move forward without carrying the weight of endless resentment. New opportunities emerged almost organically. I found work that inspired me, spaces where my ideas and abilities were respected. Friendships deepened with people who understood my journey and did not judge me for the scars I carried. I even allowed myself to consider love again, cautiously, tentatively, aware that trust must be earned and nurtured. It was not the same reckless faith I once gave freely, but a mature, guarded optimism that promised growth rather than destruction. There were moments of unexpected intrigue, little ripples suggesting that the story might not be entirely over. My ex-stepmother occasionally attempted contact, but I remained firm. My children, or those I considered family, reacted in ways I did not anticipate, testing boundaries, questioning loyalties, revealing that the past casts long shadows even when the present feels stable. These reminders were not threats, they were lessons, evidence that vigilance and discernment are essential in a life rebuilt. Looking back, I realized that every betrayal, every tear, every sleepless night was a part of a larger narrative that ultimately strengthened me. Life had tested me in ways I could never have imagined, but it also revealed the depth of my resilience. I was no longer the passive observer of my own suffering. I was an active architect of my recovery, a witness to justice, and the keeper of my own destiny. To anyone listening to this story, the lesson is both simple and profound. Never allow anyone to diminish your worth or control your life through deception. Trust, yes, but with eyes open and hearts guarded. Stand firm in the truth, even when lies seem convincing. The storm may feel endless, but beyond it lies clarity, growth, and sometimes the satisfaction of witnessing justice unfold naturally. I leave you with this thought: the strongest power you have is the one you reclaim from the hands of those who sought to control it. Guard it, nurture it, and use it to shape a life that cannot be broken by deceit or betrayal. Life will always test you, but within that testing lies the path to your own strength. And sometimes the final chapter is not about revenge. It is about rising, standing taller, and walking forward with the quiet certainty that you have survived, and that survival itself is victory.